right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Wednesdays. I'm TJ Van Tol. I work as a developer advocate at Progress. And with me today, as always, my co-host, Dan Wilson.
Hey, I'm Dan Wilson. I work with Digital Primates. We do enterprise React stuff. And we curate the Enterprise React newsletter. So if you're into great enterprise content, Google it, subscribe. We never sell your email.
Awesome. And our guest today is it Swizec? You said Swiz, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Swiz is easier to pronounce.
Perfect. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Swiz. I'm a software engineer. I work with startups primarily, and on the side, I'm writing a newsletter about React, about software careers, and I'm teaching how to build your own product with React and serverless, because I think it's a really great way to get into, and I really think that front-end engineers can do everything these days, and that's amazing. So I want to push everyone in that direction.
For sure. So we're going to talk about authentication today, which I mean, is a topic I definitely know in and out. I'm a complete master of, but I know Dan really isn't. So why don't you maybe explain like what we're going to be covering today, or sort of your personal interest in authentication? Because I think it's a thing that a lot of people, joking aside, me too, really struggle with.
So authentication is one of those things that I think pretty much any app that takes payments also has some level of authentication. You have users, you have to differentiate between free users, between paid users, and all that stuff. And it's really hard to get authentication right, at least in my experience. I've been around back in the days where everyone wrote their own authentication schema in PHP, saved passwords in plain text in the database or on a file. And, I don't know if anyone in the audience remembers that, but times were really rough in the old days of the internet, where you had bots crawling. And if you were a PHP site, your passwords got stolen. And if you gave your password to anyone, your password got stolen. And somebody used it somewhere else, and that's why you should never reuse your passwords. So it's really hard to get authentication right, but at the end of the day, it's a lot of very kind of schleppy things. You need some way of checking, is this user currently authenticated? You need some way of saying, how can this user authenticate? And all of that kind of, as I've built more and more of those systems, I realized, I don't need to build this from scratch every time. What if I make a library that can do this for me? So I created useAuth, which is a React hook that lets you add, it basically lets you add authentication to any React site in like 5 minutes or something, maybe 10.
Wow, that's impressive. If I'm being totally transparent with you fine folks, there's a whole lot of cool ideas I've thought of over the years that I'd want to build an app for. And by the time I work through, I've got to get a framework. I've got to deal with authentication. I've got to set up a data store. I've got to do this, and this. All the jam goes right out of the donut, and all the fun I thought I was going to have, I'm not going to have it now. And that idea didn't really get anything done with it. So it's nice to hear someone has kind of taken out the authentication sliver of doubt. Can you kind of walk us through what the library does?
Yeah, so I think the easiest is to show you that you can actually integrate this in like 5 minutes. So I'm going to share my screen.
And I'm starting the stopwatch.
Okay, start the stopwatch. So I didn't memorize my demo because I have bad memory. So I'm going to actually follow the docs on useAuth. And I have a plain Gatsby site. I used the Gatsby blog starter to create a plain website. And the reason I'm using Gatsby is because it gives you a bunch of really cool, really nice defaults that I like. And it means I don't have to deal with setting up pages and stuff like that. But useAuth works with Next.js and with Create React App, and probably with anything, but I haven't tried it with everything else yet. So we're going to say yarn add react useAuth. This is going to install the library.
You want to bump up your font sizes while that's installing there?
Is that better?
You could even go bigger than that, honestly.
Even bigger? How about that?
That works. Thank you.
So I'm going to up yarn start. Then I'm going to copied the first part of the library, which is the auth provider. This is the part that takes care of all of your basically of sharing state. And I'm going to copy that into two parts of Gatsby, into Gatsby node, and no, not Gatsby node, into Gatsby browser and Gatsby is it node, or is it Gatsby? Let's go with Gatsby browser for starters. So we're going to export the root element here. This is wrapping our entire site in the auth provider. I'm going to import the auth provider as well. And this is going to make it work on, this makes it work in the browser. We need to import React as well. Import
So if
React.
this wasn't a Gatsby site, would this be like in your like index.js file? Is this like
Yes.
totally root level? Okay.
So basically, you want to put the auth provider at the most root level possible, because that's what gives the useAuth hook access to your authentication state.
Okay.
So I put that in the wrap root element. I do need to put it in the browser as well. No, I did put it in the browser. I need to put it into Gatsby SSR. So I'm going to take all of this and copy it into a new one. And the reason it needs to be in Gatsby SSR, for those of you who aren't familiar with Gatsby, is that Gatsby has two modes of working. One is the compile time, when it's building your site into static HTML. The other is when it's in the actual browser, and you need to have access to authentication on both of those, not because you would actually render authenticated pages that much, but it makes your life easier because you don't get undefined errors. So that is the basic things. I'm using my default auth0 parameters because this is like an auth0 account that I'm using for demos and documentation, so it's easier for people to get started. And now the next thing we need to do is a callback page. This is because we're using an auth provider that has what's called like auth0. And that auth0 means that when we authenticate, we're going to go to OAuth, sorry. So we're using OAuth, and that's going to redirect us to an external provider for users, and then go back to our page. And this callback page is what we're going to need. And then we're going to be authenticated. So now we can go to Gatsby Starter blog. I'm going to open the page, and let's add a button on the blog index that logs you in. So we're going to take the login and logout actions from useAuth. Let's take the useAuth is authenticated as well, so we can check whether you're currently authenticated. We need to actually import useAuth. So import useAuth from React useAuth. That. And now I should be able to, oh, ESLint is bugging. Okay, that's weird. So my prettier isn't working right now, but we should still be able to make this work. I'm going to render a button here. I'm gonna say, let's see. If you are authenticated, then we render a logout button that says logout. Otherwise, we're going to render a login button like that. And we're going to say on click, we're going to call logout, or we're going to call on click equals login. And why? Oh, I know why Prettier is bugging out. Has anyone noticed this problem with VS Code where they made this decision to force you to reconfigure your code formatting, but it's hidden in this tiny notification bell?
I have not, no, but I don't use Prettier. I just use whatever ships by default in VS Code. So
okay.
It might just be related to how because I'm assuming that's an extension that's doing that.
I think so. I think they made it so that you have to you have to choose your configuration. Okay. So we now have a login button here. And when I click this, it goes to auth0, which is an authentication provider. So we're now authenticating me with auth0. I already have an account. I log in, come back, and it says that I cannot read property path name of undefined. That's interesting. That looks like, where is that bug on auth0 callback? Why is the layout not providing a location? So that's something to do with the starter I used. Layout needs the current location.
Is it because it like can't find the place to route you to, more or less, from the redirect?
I don't think so. It's something to do with the actual layout, where it's looking at the location here and expecting to get it as a property, and we're not passing it in as a property here.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's a different starter than I usually use, so it has some bells and whistles that I'm not used to. But we can fix that, but by not rendering the layout of the page. Let's try that again. I'm gonna log in. Okay, let's start again from scratch. Damn it.
You're fine. At least you got a different error message. That's always a good sign.
Yeah,
You just
that is
affected
good.
something.
It's a clue.
It does say I'm logged in. So let's try again. Log in. I go to the auth0 page, which is the authentication provider. Get logged in, and I got redirected to the home page.
And it
And
says
there's
log
now
out.
a logout button.
That looks great.
So the next thing we can do, because is what was I going to say? So we get a bunch of info back from auth0. So we can say we have posts. So we're down here. We can also render stuff about show stuff about the user. So I'm going to take the user from useAuth, and we now have access to data about the user. And we can say user dot. Why is it not auto-completing? There we go. Let's go with nickname. The user.nickname should now show up here. You know exactly who I am.
Is that? I'm curious how VS Code knew that. Is that?
Yeah, right.
Where is it getting that object from? Like, what is? Help me follow the trail here. Where is user coming from here?
Okay, so user is coming from useAuth.
Oh, it's coming from the hook. Okay.
So useAuth returns a bunch of stuff, and everything that it returns is declared in TypeScript. Come on.
Very nice.
Why can't I never jump there? So our useAuth interface gives us, let me do it this way. So it tells us exactly what comes back. We get whether you're currently authenticating, that's so you can show loading states. Because in the beginning, see, if I reload the page, it knows that I'm logged in. It doesn't forget that. So it first checks that I'm logged in, and then puts you in the right state. It tells you whether you're currently authenticated, whether you're authorized. So you have support for user roles as well. Gives you all of the info about the user ID, and a couple of helper functions that you can use to manage state. So you can say login, log out, and that's the main part.
I like this a whole lot. I know one question I have is, how coupled is this right now to auth0? Like, is there a future where it could potentially be like a generic solution that you almost have to like share most of the implementation, but like have some that's swap outable?
Yeah. So this is currently pretty tied to auth0. I always wanted to make it generic, so you can use it with any authentication provider that supports a similar protocol. I haven't gotten around to it, so I'm planning in the next month or two to have that support out. So right now it's for auth0. There's nothing in theory preventing it from working with any authentication provider. It's just that they all have slightly different APIs, and I haven't put in the work yet to make that happen. I'm probably going to go with Netlify Identity first, and then maybe Firebase, Cognito, and so on.
For those who may not fully know the capabilities of auth0, what options are there for authentication?
So auth0 has they have really good support for out of the box. They always support username and password authentication. They support social logins, so you can support a Google login, Twitter logins, Facebook logins, and so on. They have, I think they support passwordless as well, where you have the Slack kind of flow where it sends you an email and then you have to go to the email and go through those hoops. I haven't actually looked at everything they have just yet, but one nice thing that I like about using Auth0 for my own products is that I don't have to deal with user management at all. So if we go into what's the one that I use for examples, useAuth. This is the example page. It shows you when people have logged in, who your users are,
Oh, fancy.
and stuff like that. It also has support for user roles, which I use on my I use user roles on my video courses to give people access to different tiers and to different courses.
Can you walk through how the roles process works? I've
Yes.
never seen this before, and I'm pretty fascinated. Like, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about there being a certain amount of utility you have to do to get any kind of app whatsoever. And it sounds like a whole lot of this is now available in the ether for free. So I'm curious.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'd also like to broaden that question. I'm sort of curious, like if you wanted to, because I think this relates to roles, like if you wanted to make an admin section of your site, right? Regardless of how you implement it, I'd be curious, like if you just use the hook to like put is authenticated around like the route, or like how you handle that.
Yes. Let's give that a shot. So it's been a while since I set that up from scratch, so I might get lost a little, but let's see.
You can do it either way. You don't necessarily have to like implement it. If it's rough, we could talk through it and just at a high level, and that works too.
I have blogs on it, so I know there's a process you can follow. It's just that it's been a while since I set it up. Actually, no. Let's give it a shot. Let's go to use auth, and I'm going to find myself, create a role.
I still haven't found myself.
Let's give this a live code role. Is allowed to live code. Then I'm going to grant that role to myself. So I'm going to find myself, Swizec.com, sign. So I now have access to the live code role, which means I should be able to use the is authorized function.
Oh, interesting.
So we are in here.
And so this will be the gate where you check for the role.
Yeah, exactly. So we can say if
that really just takes a lot of the crud work out of building an app.
Or we called it live code, right? Then we show the blogs. Otherwise, we do not show blogs. Oh crap! Okay, let's try logging out and logging back in. Maybe it needs to refresh that I have those roles. Why is it saying that's sad?
Did we call it live? You want to check the spelling on that? Did we call it live code or live coding, or did we do
called live code?
And what's in the code? It's in the index.js file. Did we also call it live code in there?
Let's see, did we? I said
okay, we did. Yeah, okay.
Authorized live code. So okay, that's. I think I'm just forgetting how to use this, but it's supposed to. Oh no, I know what's wrong. There's a rule that you have to add to auth0 to actually populate something. Let me look that up real quick.
Yeah, and while you're doing that too, I'm with you, Dan. Like I've been through the dark days of doing this in PHP. I did this sort of thing in Java, which probably shortened my lifespan a little bit. So just to see a few function calls in here to do this is pretty slick. And also point out, if you have any questions in the chat, we're just really, it could be about authentication in general, auth0, the useAuth hook here. Feel free to chime in and I can bring it up to the group.
Well, I do hate to distract Swizz from what he's doing, but one of the guys on our team sent me a Slack message asking for links to his courses. He doesn't have a Twitter account, so he can't. I mean, a Twitch account, so he can't ask the question directly. But do we have the course links here in the briefing doc? Is that serverless React Dev?
There. You can also go to swizec.com and Splunk from there. There's a link to my courses. Wait. So since version we support auth 0 rules or little snippets of JavaScript, yes. Go to rules and click create rule, start an empty rule and paste this code. Yeah. It helps. Apparently, even if you write the docs yourself, it still helps to actually read them when you're using them.
I've fallen into this trap before.
Yep. And then we need the custom property namespace. Okay, got it. So we're gonna call this the namespace, the let's call it useauth.dev. This is a website. This is a domain I bought a year ago, and I still have not put anything up. But it will have docs very soon.
I know how that goes. I finally stopped renewing domains that I had, which were going to be great business ideas that I carried forward for like 10 years. And finally, I'm like, why am I paying all this money? I'm not going to do anything.
I know.
I finally gave up.
Yeah, I feel, yeah. I just renewed a domain automatically that I bought as a joke on stage when I was doing a demo. So if you go to ishotdogtaco.com, you will be able to see that 89% of people agree that a hot dog is a type of taco. Okay, so I added the custom property namespace, and there is an auth 0 rule that adds my roles into the metadata that comes with the user. So I should now be able to I should now have the role, and I think I do. I'm seeing the articles. Cool. So now it works. If you,
awesome.
Yep.
So that takes care of your infrastructure to define roles, to assign roles, and then to check for roles. And then it's up to obviously the application developer to decide what should or should not happen based on the absence or presence of the role for the user.
Exactly. And the way I have this set up in my courses is that there's a file that wraps the router itself and tells the router whether you're allowed to go somewhere or not, so that it's not peppered around each page.
So in this situation, the actual login screen is on auth 0, right? And you're sort of delegating off to that. Mm-hmm. Would this solution also work if you wanted like total control over the login page itself within your, like if you needed to have like design control over the look of the login form itself?
That gets a little harder because you would have to become your own authentication provider, and that's usually the hard part. Because the reason the login screen itself is hosted by auth 0 or whatever authentication provider that you have is that way it's more secure because you're not passing usernames and passwords around as much. So it's kind of similar to using Stripe. You as the application developer don't want to get a user's credit card number or information at any time. You never want to handle that because it's less likely for you to do that well than it is for somebody like Stripe who does that professionally. And especially if you go into PCI compliance, it gets even worse. So I would recommend that you don't try to control the authentication experience because it's hard to get it right. Now, if you absolutely do need to control it, there are authentication providers that work just as an API that use, I think it's called JWT tokens, JSON Web Tokens, that let you do that sort of thing securely, where they're hosting the fields themselves come from the provider, but then around it you have your own sort of UI. So it's trickier, and at least the way useAuth is built right now is not really meant for that use case, to be honest.
And I have to say, as someone who occasionally logs into sites, logging in and picking a password for randomsite.com always gives me the skeevies, even though I don't reuse passwords. And so if there is an option to choose a more broadly known provider
Mhm.
and the form comes up in its own little window and I can see it's their context, I tend to trust that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's true. And especially nowadays, when you think about uh, how authentication works on smartphones, when was the last time you actually typed in your password and not just used Face ID or Touch ID to pre-fill it from your password manager?
Yeah, I think that's probably true amongst the circles of people here and that are watching this, but
Mhm.
probably less true in the greater just public. That
Yeah.
I haven't seen statistics lately on password manager use, but I I don't
So
believe it's like a huge percentage of just the general population.
I
No?
don't. I would disagree. I don't know about the Android space, but on iOS, the password manager is built in. So most people don't know that they're using a password manager. They're just using one.
It's true. Yeah, and it automatically suggests passwords now
Yeah.
also. So
I know that a startup I joined recently, we had a homegrown authentication solution, and it was built 3 or 4 years ago with all of the bells and whistles, which means that you enter your phone number, it sends you a text, you then fill out the code that you get. There's no usernames and passwords to remember, and it's amazing, right? It currently represents the biggest drop off in our sign up because people say that is too hard because they just want a username and a password field so that their phone can do it automatically. They don't have to deal with typing.
that's funny.
Yeah, my 9-year-old turned on two-factor authentication in his Fortnite account because he really needed it for some tournament thing that I'm sure he's going to win. Nick, if you're listening, I believe in you, buddy. But every time I have to do something to his account, I've got to send him scurrying downstairs to go get the tablet and come back
Yep.
up and read me the 6 numbers. And there's this balance between hassle and security. And I don't know where that is at any given point in time, but it's certainly a balance. You know, if it's too secure, you can't really use it. And if it's not secure at all, other people are using it. So how do you personally feel about this, Wiz, when you think about what to implement and how to implement it?
Yeah, I mean, it is really a hassle because, like you said, everyone wants everything to be the easiest possible, and they don't really think about security until it bites them in the ass. Um, like, especially, there was even that Equifax breach a couple years ago where they lost
Mhm.
a lot of data, and they're a very large company. How likely do you think it is that if you build a homegrown authentication solution, that yours will be better than something like Equifax? It's probably not going to get breached just because you're a smaller target and nobody cares. But if you grow to a point where somebody does care, suddenly you have a lot of trouble. Um, and it's kind of similar for in terms of ease of use, because I think that ease of use is very important for the developer experience. You want to make it easy for developers to use, and with if you leave that to if you leave the authentication part to experts, there's people there who are worrying about both sides of the equation. They're trying to make it as easy as possible for users to use. They're trying to make it as easy as possible for developers to use so that it's not difficult to integrate. And they're also trying to make it easy they're also trying to make it secure. And it's, at least in my experience, it's pretty unlikely that as a team in a business, you're going to have time to do all of that.
You know, and there's a legion of very bored people across the world that are smarter than probably us on this call and also have nothing to do. So they
Mhm.
find ways around this stuff. I remember reading about Facebook botnets, and it turns out the way that they did it was each account would require a new SIM to be put in, as a requirement for a
Mhm.
Facebook account. So they just bought SIMs in bulk, swapped them out all day long in these big arrays of cell phones, and would just keep registering accounts. And so,
Yeah.
there's for every mousetrap, there's a smarter mouse, I suppose.
Oh yeah, I heard a good philosophy I heard about that was from a friend who's running a business, and he said that he used to get into these battles with hackers when if they were trying to attack his site, and then one day he realized that he's actually competing against people who are happy to work for $1 an hour.
Yeah.
and you will never win that fight.
It makes me think of like, I think talking of random domains, one thing I always find funny is when you turn on analytics and you see all the calls to wp-login.php, right? Because of all the random bots scraping who knows what, trying to find anything they can.
They're looking all the time.
Yeah, there's bots just looking for open ports, looking for logins. I think there was a famous hack a couple of years ago where somebody realized that the default username and password on routers is admin, and they ran a botnet that just stole thousands of people's Wi-Fi routers and started using them as a botnet.
Yeah, why not? I mean, you've got access to the full connection. You can fire hose whatever you want to fire hose.
Exactly.
So we had a
What are
couple
we
good
drinking there?
messages.
I'm curious. Is it too early for a beer?
Actually, not a beer. It's a kombucha.
Oh, nice. I've never had one. What are they like?
It's really good. It's like I think it's a fermented tea, so it's kind of like I think it has 0.5% alcohol, maybe.
Oh boy, so a couple hundred of those and you'll be a little tipsy.
I know, right? No, but it's really tasty, and I like it as an alternative for caffeine.
Had a couple good messages come in from chat. So people are reminding me of password managers I wasn't thinking of. Like Chrome has one built in, and also Android as well. I didn't even think about this, but of course, Google knows exactly who you are, right? So if you're logging in with your Google account, Google's very good about making sure you keep using your Google account throughout the internet.
Or I even have on my phone, I use LastPass, and sometimes it doesn't have the password. So I use the built-in iOS password manager to fill in the passwords for LastPass to then log me into the website I'm trying to get into. Stuff like that.
It's like the inception of password managers.
Yeah, it's literally my face has become my password for anything. And if it doesn't work that way, I get pretty annoyed.
Christian also brings up, curious which OAuth 2 flows does useAuth support? This is one I don't totally understand. So
I'm not sure exactly what CJ Pillsbury means by that question, because right now useAuth only works with Auth0, and whatever OAuth 2 flow that Auth0 is using is what useAuth supports. The way that works is that when you trigger a login, you redirect the user to a new page, which then which hosts the authentication flow, and that page then redirects you back to a callback page. On that callback page, useAuth says, "Okay, you're logged in," and it saves some stuff in local storage so that it's so that you can stay logged in when you reload, and then it redirects you back to whatever page you want it to go to. So whatever that flow is called is what useAuth supports.
Very cool. I know one question I want to get to also is, speaking of like doing the auth yourself versus like, putting it off to Auth0 or whatever. I think it makes a lot of sense when we're in like the situations you're talking about. You're doing online courses, you're doing like one-off things. I've got a blog and I need to monetize part of it. Things like that make a lot of sense to me. Do you think that extends even into like sort of the corporate world? Because I know like Dan and I both have a history of working in corporate companies, insurance, these sort of industries. And I know there, for whatever reason, like this sort of thing wouldn't fly there. Like there's like an insistence that we need to own, for whatever reason, right? We need to own this entire technology stack. Do you think there's a place for like trying to encourage like companies like that to even give up control as well for some of their systems?
So that's a tricky question, because yes, the larger the company gets, and a lot of small startups, because of the way VC incentives are set up, are into empire building, and they try to do as much as possible in-house, even if it's a complete waste of time. So what I've seen in my career is that you spend about maybe 20% of your time delivering the actual core business advantage and objective that you have for your company, and 80% of your development time goes to every SaaS thing that every company has. You're building authentication, you're building delivering emails, you're building user management, all of that crap that I kind of think it's sad that we're all building it from scratch every time. It's like 20 years ago where everyone built their own CMS or their own PHP framework. But the problem with companies, especially when it comes to authentication, is that they want to feel like they're in control. And I feel like they are afraid of compliance issues from using third-party providers. And to an extent, everyone likes to think that their company is going to outlive every other company. So, like your 10 people startup is definitely going to run out of, like, Auth0 is definitely going to go out of business, and then you'll have to scramble and won't be able to log people in, or stuff like that. Now, if this was a Google provider, that is totally fair. Google kills products after 2 years. But Auth0 has now been around for long enough that I think they'll be around for a while. And if you use something like useAuth, which is soon going to make it easy to switch providers, you kind of get away from that concern. But for a large Fortune 100 company, I think it is fair to say we need this provider to be a very stable vendor, and we need them to provide us with an SLA, because we've been around for 50 years and we're building stuff that needs to work for the next 50 years. We can't switch providers every 5 years when startups come and go.
Well, that said, but if someone used your useAuth library, that would sort of encapsulate the vendor specific code.
Mm-hmm.
And even if the library doesn't support it, one could use those contracts or those extension points and plug in their own system, and it would be transparent to the applications that you've used useAuth in. And so, for exactly what you're saying, if someone wants to test the waters or even just gain potential insurance later, this is a solution for that.
Yeah,
well,
definitely.
The code would be isolated, but I think the bigger concern is the actual back end, right? Because I don't think you'd be concerned about having to rewrite your code, but more that, like, if you build a service that has 10,000, 50,000 users, and then suddenly Auth0 says, like, sorry, like, you can export your stuff, but there's still probably going to be some inconvenience both for you to, like, migrate that data, and probably maybe even something for your users. Like, they're probably going to do, like, pick a new password or something to migrate them over. And it's just a hassle that I guess it sort of depends on your scale, right? I like the way you phrased it. Like, if you're like Fortune 100, like, there's a certain high tier where, like, Facebook is not going to use Auth0, right? Like, they're
exactly
full team, talented engineers. They're capable of doing this. And on the flip side, there's, like, people writing, like, individual courses, small businesses and such. This is like a given, right? Like, those people should not be trying to write all of this themselves. It's that middle area where things are interesting. Because, like, even Progress, I could say, we're a decent sized company, but we're not like Fortune 100 or anywhere near that. But we have our own custom auth stuff, right? We're not using authentication providers. We have all of that stuff in house. So we're very much in that zone of, like, and that stuff is, like, yes, we control it, and there's some benefits to that, but it's also a huge hassle for having to maintain all that infrastructure. And anytime you want to collect user data, because you mentioned, like, compliance and stuff as well, like, we have to deal with GDPR issues and like all of these things. We're more directly responsible for complying with some of these guidelines and these recommendations than we would be if we just sort of push that off for somebody else to handle it.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that if there was regulation or legislation around how you have to keep users private and secure, I think the calculus would change a lot, because it's still kind of the Wild West. Nobody's going to actually come and give you a $1 million penalty because you save user passwords in a text file.
True.
Well, what's interesting is when GDPR first came out, there was a bunch of tizzies. People were freaking out about it because it carried very heavy financial penalties if you ran afoul of it. But the little sneaky part of it that really caused people to lose their minds over is it didn't necessarily matter where the user was in the world. It only mattered that they were an EU citizen.
Yep.
So you could be in international waters on a sailing ship outside of the jurisdiction of the EU, but yet this legislation affected you. So a lot of people had to make a lot of changes in how they dealt with data. In the US, we've been insulated from that, except for California has a very, very similar bit of legislation that covers Californians regardless of where they're at. So I think, that world you're envisioning has started to appear, and it's going to be tough on folks who can't be responsible with others' data.
And that's still only if you get caught. I think what would be interesting is also if there were proper penalties with data leaks, especially for large companies. If you lose 1 million people's private info, right now nothing really happens. But if it did, I think the calculus of who should be doing authentication and who shouldn't would change a lot.
I think like things like PCI compliance in the credit card world has sort of affected that greatly, because even like when I worked in big insurance, we didn't handle credit cards. So like even though we handled our own login infrastructure, we said we're not touching credit cards, right? We'll let somebody else deal with that. And like I can't remember what magic we were using. So like even just that small bit of extra little bit of hurdles in terms of regulation in the credit card world, I think has had some impact already.
Yeah, and I think it's also similar to the mantra that you should never roll your own encryption, because it looks like it's super easy. And I think
easy.
authentication is similar. It looks super easy. You look at the problem, and as an engineer, you say, "Oh yeah, I can solve that in an hour." But the details get really hairy very quickly.
Let me break up my elliptic curve cryptography books. There's got to be an easy answer in there somewhere.
Exactly.
One thought I did have is, some companies do use multiple providers, and it kind of is interesting to see why they might do that. Going back to Fortnite, Fortnite's owned by Epic Games, and Epic Games provides these massive games for free. And so, the way they make money obviously is convince you need to pay real money for fake things. At least that's how I interpret their mission. But you can sign in to Epic Games with an Epic Games account, Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, and there's probably 4 or 5 others I'm not even thinking about. And they've optimized for, we don't care how you want to log in, just eventually give us some money.
Yep. Yeah. And again, this is something that Auth0 and I think a lot of other providers really support well. And it's like you said, Fortnite is not in the business of figuring out the best way to authenticate people. They're in the business of selling fake things for real money. And that's what they should focus on. Otherwise, they're just wasting their time.
Yeah. So when you use Auth0 the way you have it, can you sort of select which providers are available to the user, or is it so you can?
Yeah, it has. There's a bunch of plugins that they call them, and you can choose which providers you allow. So
that's handy.
I haven't really checked. Let me look real quick. I think they have a bunch.
And while you're looking it up, I'll put one last call. We've got about 10, 15 minutes left here. So if you're watching this in chat and you have any other questions, we're talking to Swiz here about just authentication and React in general, and a useAuth hook that he built that's run by Auth0 under the hood. So if any of that sounds interesting, you have any last questions, we got about 10, 15 more minutes here. So make sure you get them in so we can ask them here before we run out of time.
Yeah, I'm having trouble right now finding exactly what they support, but I found that they support custom social connections. So you can make your own if you want, which is cool. And they also, one nice thing they have as well is support for single sign-on. So stuff like Okta and other things that people use in the enterprise world. And it has some support for multi-factor auth as well. So you don't have to worry about that. And by the way, I am not actually affiliated with Auth0. I just really hate doing my own authentication.
This broadcast brought to you by the fine folks at Auth0.
Yeah, I wish.
Well, if they build a good product and it's something you can use to make your own life better or other people's better, there's no shame in that. Like, it's good to use good things.
Yeah. And that's also why I built useAuth. I was actually working on a course on how to build your own app from scratch, and I realized that as I was going through the motions, that the authentication part and state management for that is very repetitive. So I figured, you know what, we can wrap this up in a library. People don't want to learn this. People just want to have it.
Right. You know, when I was doing some of the research for this broadcast, it kind of apologize for not knowing this, but apparently you seem to have a book writing addiction. Can you talk through how that happened multiple times? Because I'm sure that's a daunting experience.
Book writing. So the best advice I can give you about writing and writing books in particular is don't write unless you can't not write. And I really enjoy writing. I enjoy the process of going through doing the research, and it helps me learn and get better as well. And it also then produces something that's useful to other people. So right now I'm working on the Serverless Handbook, which is a free online book you can get at serverlesshandbook.dev. And it's about how I believe that every front-end engineer these days can do backend because of technology has gotten to that point. So I set out to write a book to teach you the stuff that you need to know to be able to pull that off. Because at the end of the day, these days you can do backend by just writing a JavaScript function, but you still need some others. It's a little different way of thinking about it than if you're doing front-end JavaScript. So that's what that one is about. And I wrote a couple of books on data visualization because it's really fun to visualize things, and data is amazing. And it's almost like an art form these days, I think.
Yeah, no, good data visualization really can make the point. If at some point when you forget that you were on this show, we're going to ask you to come back and do one on data visualization. That's fascinating. And cool. I mean, I can't think of a more authoritative person than the dude that wrote 4 books on the topic. That's compared to me writing 0 books on the topic. So clearly I defer to your expertise, sir.
Yeah. Data viz is fun.
That actually sort of gets into the last question I have for you is, so this is an open source project, right? Mm-hmm. Do you have goals to like see this thing grow? Is this something you'd like to have contributors to, or is this more just like, this is useful for me, I'm putting this out there, this is great if you use it, sort of thing?
So I think there's something there. I would love to get more contributions. I think we're at up to 11 contributors now, something like that.
Nice.
And I love getting bug fixes, PRs, recommendations with like stuff. I like getting examples. Somebody built a really cool example that's going to become the docs page on useauth.dev.
Very cool.
Once I have the infrastructure in place to support multiple authentication providers, I will be extremely happy if people start adding them, so I don't have to write it for everyone.
That gets into the word, like the dealing with the specifics of each provider, because everybody's got their own, like
exactly.
Having went down this path sort of before, you find out about services that you didn't even know existed.
Mm-hmm.
That are super important. We have a shout out for one of your books.
Yeah, nice. So you got a fan of your D3 book in chat, so we'll make sure to drop a link to that. Actually, it's on you. I'll drop your website here in the chat too, because you've got a link to it there. Cool. If anybody's interested in checking that out. And at this point, if we got a few minutes left, is there anything on the topic of just auth, or really anything in general at this point that you want to cover, you feel like that we haven't touched on to this point? Or
don't use SMS as 2-factor authentication. Use an app.
Like an authenticator app?
Yes.
Is that something useAuth does for you also?
Auth0 would have to do that for you.
Or
Auth that's what I meant, really deal with it. Yes, useAuth Auth0 supports multi-factor authentication, but just in general, when you're setting up 2-factor auth, which you should set up for everything that you own or anything even remotely important, because SMS can be spoofed and people can steal your account that way. It's I don't know exactly how it works, but you can basically convince a cell provider that you're somebody else and get their 2-factor authentication token, and then get into their account.
Fun times.
Yeah, super fun times. Yeah.
Green Fusion, actually said that you helped he or she get their very first job in the industry. And I
nice.
think there's very few things that would make me more proud than helping someone get into an industry that's been so good to me and others.
Yeah, that's
Well,
this industry is great once you get in.
actually, that should segue in. One thing we like to just end on, because thanks so much for joining us today, is just anything that we want to plug related to the topic or really related to anything to sort of wrap us up on. So is there anything that you want to plug? We've linked to your site a few times. Are there any courses or guides or blog posts you think would be of particular interest that we should give a shout out to here at the end?
I think my blog in general is a great. I'm very biased, but I think it's great.
You should be.
It's okay. Yeah.
I have a course on serverlessreact.dev that teaches you how to build a SaaS on the side, because I think every software engineer these days should have a small SaaS on the side, because those are up and coming, and the industry I think is moving towards more smaller companies rather and micro SaaS than these large unicorns that everyone hates. I'm gonna have a new thing coming out in January that's even better on the same topic, Serverless React Academy. This is actually the first time I'm talking about it publicly. But
you heard it here first.
I just want everyone to write code and write great code and think about the stuff around the code a little more. I think that as engineers, we often forget that the code is just the tool. The goal is the other stuff.
Very well said. Dan, that's going to be hard to top, but do you have anything to plug?
Oh, I'll just, I guess, gently mention the newsletter one more time, the Enterprise React newsletter. What's interesting about it is all of our developers submit the articles, and that's where we pull them from. And that's how I was introduced to Swizec. So obviously they're doing the right thing by finding fine folks like you.
That's awesome.
It's also, I just want to say thank you to you, because for all of your works, you give a lot, you've done a lot. I don't know how you write books in your non-native language. I can't write books in my native language, much less good ones. So as a tireless community person, I just want to say thank you for your energy that you put into it. It means a lot to a lot of folks, including Green Fusion.
Thank you.
And I'll end by saying, so next week on React Wednesdays, we're taking a week off because we are doing an online conference next week, which I'm going to drop it in the chat. And I also put links if you want to check out Dan's enterprise newsletter, the serverless React course as well. I toss those in the chat as well. But DevReach next week, basically it's an event we normally hold every year in Sofia, Bulgaria that Dan's been to. It's a fun time. Swiz, if it happens in person, we'd love to have you there sometime. Not happening this year in person, so we're actually doing it all on Twitch and all for free because we're trying to just do something different, right? There's a pandemic, so why not have some fun with it? So if you're interested, DevReach, I threw a link in the chat. We'll be on Twitch all next week, so it's free. You can just drop in casually, hang out. Tuesday is the React Day, so we screwed up not putting it on Wednesday for consistency, but it is what it is. And in general, telerik.com/React Wednesdays. If you like this chat, we do this basically every Wednesday, next week aside. So we have some awesome guests like Swiz. Maybe we'll convince them to come back to do data viz here sometime as well.
Do it.
But thanks everyone for joining me. Swiz, this was awesome. I learned a lot about auth. I'll have to check this out. So
yeah, thanks for having me.
Very good.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. See ya.